I mentioned earlier this morning that today is mostly the database day. It's a big day, the day, because the database, we hope we'll have corpus tonight. So now in my sort of second lecture today, I want to talk a little bit about sort of corpus structure. What type of a database? What do we have to a little bit think about when we prepare a database? Or when we have a database and want to use it for some particular investigation. Because of course, there are two types of databases. Some of them is which we create ourselves, record. The databases for this typological analysis are expensive and tough to create. Lina would probably can give us some stories about the effort kind of needing to go to these type of things. Recording is one thing, of course. Processing, metadata, labeling, annotation, all of this it's a lot of work. It's very, very time-consuming and eventually expensive thing to do. And but of course there is a lot of data out there. There is a lot of speech out there. So there are the other type of databases where you can sort of crawl essentially some internet, some podcasts or whatever, in theory, and gather data. That's also very difficult because you have to have the sort of technical knowledge to do that. And I guess the most difficult thing about this type of a crawling thing is the other legal issues. The privacy. You have to be well aware, you have to be technically skilled to be able to check all the licenses, whether you actually can take the data, what can you use them for. So it's a sort of logistic and legal nightmare to do something like that. Luckily, not everybody maybe is, not everybody may be so prudent. In particular, big corporations, they gather all sort of databases in one way or the other, and they have the legal power to fence the potential issues. And some of them share part of the data. So, for example, we're talking about the Mozilla Common Voice database. That's a proprietary database by Mozilla company, but they share it for academic purposes. There are many other databases like that. Usually these databases are designed to be used for speech synthesis or speech recognition very often purposes. There are some sort of differences between the databases which are used for speech synthesis and databases which are used for speech recognition. There are different requirements. Nowadays, there is this overreaching requirements of a lot of data. So nowadays those databases are sort of a little bit merging, because essentially for speech synthesis you would want decent quality data from maybe one or two speakers and plenty, and necessarily not hugely varied, while because you want to produce one good voice and allow it to do all sort of controlled variation of the speech, while for the speech automatic speech recognition you want as diverse data, as many speakers, maybe less material from many speakers, because you want to make sure that your system covers all sort of potential issues. Many voices, it can recognize speech from many people, recognizes speech from uttered in all sort of environments. So you might want some noisy data as well. You might want loud data. You might want people crying and what have you. So there are these differences between the type of database we might need. But nowadays, essentially, you need most data. So for synthesis, because we nowadays usually build synthesizers routinely, which speak in many languages, many voices, many styles. So the ASR databases are just fine for synthesis recognition. And a lot of synthesis databases are gathered with the variety in mind. So then they can be used also for the recognition purposes. So today what I'm going to be talking about, I'm just going to talk some basic characteristics of speech corpora. This is by no means exhaustive lecture. There are some things which kind of came in mind with these particular techniques we are talking about, and we can be open for discussions. If many of you have some experience with collecting data, all of that is very, very interesting and very relevant. A little bit about the recordings and metadata primarily. So I'll revisit this concept of sources of variations what sources of variations there will be in the database, and what type of variation we want, and what type of variation we might not want necessarily. And then I will talk a little bit about the balancing the data, the concept of balancing the data and representativeness of the data. So, what is a speech corpus? Is it just a collection of recordings? So if we have, you know, like some cloud server somewhere which contains 100 hours of recordings of some sort, can we really call that a speech database or speech corpus? Well, not really, because we don't know what's there. So the corpus, the bunch of recordings become a corpus or database only when we know what's there. So let's say that a bunch of recordings becomes a corpus when we have recordings and metadata. We have some meaning characteristics of the recordings. The metadata, of course, have to contain the things which interest us, which is relevant for our research question potentially or technological application we are building. And of course, then the corpus can be turned to a database when we process those recordings and we extract some particular characteristics, some particular features which might interest us. So there are several, this is again not an exhaustive list, several sort of types of recordings. I was talking about that a little bit. So there are these sort of controlled type of recordings. As phoneticians, this is usually for the standard phonetic analysis, this is the sort of bread and butter of our life. We create these controlled, maybe small databases of some speech recordings. You know, we often carefully design phrases. You know, we're interested in angami tones, so we create some sort of word list or some short sentences which contain all the tonal variation. If there might be some Sandhi characteristics, we have to make sure that all of those combinations are there. We take some representative speakers, you know, we input them into the nicely controlled environment and tell them to read something, or we tell them not to read something, or anything like that, you know. But there were very many sort of speech data used for sort of speech analysis purposes are actually studio recordings. And there are different types of the studios. Of course, your studio is some kind of room, usually with a microphone of some sort, and it's kind of quiet. Yeah? It's sort of soundproof, isolated from the rest of the environment. And there are different levels of this soundproofing. You know, this ultimate soundproofing is this anechoic chamber, which is sort of designed essentially to remove every echo possible. Because of course when I speak, my voice is bouncing off all of these walls around. So when there is a microphone in the middle, we can use signal analysis techniques to actually even discern the type of the room we're recording. The small room, more sort of faster coming echo. The bigger room, more slowly coming echo. But some echo will be there, always. Anechoic chamber is this, it's this sort of room with sort of soft walls, and there may be some strange shapes, wooden shapes on the walls, which tries to deflect those echoes somewhere where they don't land back on the microphone. I don't know if you've been to anechoic chamber. I don't know if you have anechoic chamber here. It's actually rather spooky for me. When you are there, we actually do not have an anechoic chamber in Helsinki. Well, I mean in our department, but we used once or twice our kind of colleagues' anechoic chamber in Stockholm. And it's sort of really strange. To me, at least, it feels almost suffocating, because it's not right. There is no echo. You're used to this echo. The only good feature about that anechoic chamber is that it's sort of this trampoline-like floor. So I can sometimes goes there, jump in there. But so as a phonetician, I really don't necessarily want anechoic chamber recordings, because I'm interested in as representative speech as possible. And I think that this anechoic chamber is a little bit weird. So then there are, of course, soundproof rooms, which are well proved enough, so you don't hear the noises outside. You don't hear the car traffic and whatever. Metro traffic, as we actually have it in Helsinki, running under us and all that. So that's fine. And but there's not sort of necessarily super sound treated inside. So if there is you feel like being in a relatively small, furbished room. There are some soft walls, so that's just about fine. It's actually quite okay. Of course, many times we do not have, when we do the field recordings, we don't have this comfort to bring people to the studio. So we have to record wherever we can, sometimes in people's living rooms, or sometimes on the street, or sometimes, around the campfire or whatever is fine for us. But we of course have to then live with that. We have to kind of live with the idea that we recorded other type of sounds than what we actually are investigating, and we have to sort of work with that. We can either use some signal processing technique to sort of try to remove those things, or then we might need a lot of other data, because this environment creates this source of variation, which is unwanted. So we might need some sort of varied data where we can somehow statistically remove it, that on average, this extra noise is going to be sort of zero. It averages itself out. So there are many techniques what we can do. Of course, with the speaking material, because we will end up with a relatively little material, so we want the repetitions of the same thing, more or less. Because, if you're interested in some rare tonal pattern in your language, imagine some rare Sandhi pattern, and you record some random speech, it might only occur once. Even in 10 minutes, and it occurs once. So we have to kind of really build it in, create those situations. Of course, very often in this control thing, we use this read speech type of a thing. Tell people to read, they sit in the studio, and there is a screen and a piece of paper, and they read whatever comes their way. And then we click the button, the text changes, and they read the next one. Sometimes what we do is to little bit get these reading things out. Not that this is sort of perfect, but we show the text to them, in particular short sentence, and we tell them to say it only when it disappears. So they little bit memorize it, and well, I don't know how non-read speech. We of course have to always admit, because this sort of register is important. As we know, the register kind of influences all sort of characteristics of speech. We were talking about that yesterday, kind of offline together, that when Priyanka was talking about the rhythmic characteristics of different languages, register influences those as well. We had with my colleague Stefan Beňuš, we had this paper called Rhythm and Tempo in Slovak, and we did some sort of rhythm clustering of some Slovak recordings, and we had two recordings of different sort of registers. One was very carefully read, so relatively slowly read speech, and the other one was sort of more spontaneous and really fast speech. And we ran the same type of rhythm kind of matrix on these two corpora, and they clustered very differently. One clustered more or less with the syllable based thing, which would be kind of received knowledge for Slovak. It's sort of this Western Slavic language with the word initial stress and all that. But the other one clustered with the sort of stress time language. So all of these are a very important thing to kind of control and to be aware of what you are doing and report it. When you have only the read speech, one paragraph, like we will have today, we cannot say that we have sort of analyzing speech, its own its variety. We're analyzing this particular register of speech. Of course, there are other type of things like spontaneous speech, of course. We can, in theory, not in practice, but in theory, you can put a microphone somewhere and let people to talk. In practice, you cannot do that. You're well aware of that. So, but we can, of course, get people to the studio sometimes and let them to talk together, and let them, if we have a lot of time, if after half an hour the students of similar age, even they don't know each other, they will start talking, of course. Again, we lose control. We don't know necessarily what they are saying. Of course, we can prompt them, talk about childhood memories or whatever. So we can prompt them to get roughly the area like that, but we get sort of more spontaneous type of speech. Or we can tell them to retell some story, read something, we talk about something else, and then what was there. So then we control it a little bit more, and it's more spontaneous. Of course, in the sort of unscripted dialogues, usually our experience is that, not always, but very often, one person is more talkative than the other. So we get like 80% of material from one person, and from the other sometimes just oh, like that. But of course, we have to live with all of these type of things. To sort of elicit a little bit better data, which we can control this degree of sort of how much people speak, there exist all of these sort of game-like tasks. That usually there are these sort of, that we put two people in a studio. Sometimes in Helsinki, for example, we have these two booths which are isolated from each other, sound isolated, but there is a window between them. So we can record two people communicating, and we don't have this sort of, we only have one person in the microphone. They hear the others through the kind of well-insulated headphones. So we can get them to play all sort of games, Like the map task game is very typical that, you get somebody gets, both people get sort of a map of some area, as it were, and with some objects, for example, and one has a path drawn through that. And then the one has to kind of communicate that path to the other who is following that, and they have to communicate. And of course, if we want a little bit better communication, we can have those maps not identical. So somewhere somebody has this tree and the other one has the house, and it goes like, oh, that is a tree, you turn left, and it's like, there's no tree. So, oh, what do you mean? There is a tree. Where are you? That type. So we can elicit these type of things. One of our students came up with this idea that we let the people to play Sudoku together. So they had the Sudoku, both of them, and they had to kind of do the Sudoku together. But the Sudoku had some pieces where some squares were only present on, they were not completely identical, so there was missing information in these two Sudokus. So they had to kind of communicate. That worked quite well, for example. Particularly people get kind of competitive and they start, competing and going there. Of course, there are all sort of things in between. Like there are things like, radio plays, podcasts, you can get, I guess they are somewhat, of course they are not really scripted. Well, radio plays are of course kind of fully scripted, but they are then performed by the actors who are pretending that they are not fully scripted. Then there are podcasts which are not fully scripted, but then they are done by these professionals who have their mannerisms, so it's sort of little bit repetitive. So there are all of these type of things in between. Of course, very often for example, speech synthesis corpora, unlike speech recognition corpora, we use actors. We use trained actors to record the corpus, because we might need something like 20 hours of recording from one person. And that means that, we record it over several weeks, because you can, usually the rule of thumb is that you can use roughly half of what you record. The rest is like, coughing and repeating and going like, oh, sorry, I messed it up, or, oh, don't worry, take your breath, I'll have a sip of water, that type of a thing. So half of that is sort of the usable speech. And of course, and you cannot really lock somebody to the recording room for 8 hours a day. So maybe like 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. So, you do your math, how long you need to record that. And a person like me, who is not a trained actor, or whoever is not a trained actor among you, is not very good at sort of coming the following day. You then go from the studio, pick the children from the school, and kindergarten, and cook the dinner or go out. And then you come 10 o'clock in the morning back to the studio, and you have to continue with the same voice and the same level of tiredness or whatever as the night before, as the evening before. And most of us who are not trained cannot do that really. You cannot feel, actually we recorded one of the sentences I played to you from Martti Vainio was actually part, the one which I used the voice source, was actually part of the early corpus of Finnish speech recorded by the phonetics professor nowadays, Martti. And he's not a professional trained actor, although his wife is. And it was, when we analyzed it at some point, you could really discern the Friday recordings from Monday recordings. Even sort of signal analysis wise, the pitch was way lower on Fridays than on Mondays. But of course, these actors, they get into the role. So they create for themselves a persona, and then they are capable of switching straight to that persona. So they are not necessarily themselves, but so they can be super consistent across long periods of time. Of course, the downside with the actors is that they have this mannerism, of acting mannerism. There is some particular They are trained to perform in some particular way. They are trained to perform emotions in some particular way. They are trained to read the narratives in some particular way. You know, so it's a, for example, when you try to do some emotion analysis of the data, very often people use actors. But then what you actually analyze are the acted emotion from the particular school of acting, which might be different in Europe, might be different in India, might be different in Japan. So there are these mannerisms which the actors use on stage to communicate I'm sad. So these are all the downside of this sort of semi-spontaneous kind of type of information in corpora. Again, there is no right answer to which corpus to use. It completely depends on your research question. And very often we cannot really afford or have no time to kind of record the new corpus we need. So we have to do with something which we find. You know, every sort of phonetic department has some stash of recordings of some sort. So you know, there is usually students get something which so we have to do with that very often. Of course, there are many sort of sources of variation. I'm going to be bringing this word back again and again. Sources of variation in the recordings. Something which sort of interests us is the type of the sort of language, the code essentially, or something what people use. You know, so for example, will the people record the thing in the sort of standard language? Language as such, like sort of the language which comes a label, an ISO code, tends to be a political creation. So it's some agreement among some sort of group of people, some policy, that we will speak like this when we communicate with each other. And usually it's sort of enforced by education and sometimes in some countries by sort of policing even, that, you know, oh, this cannot have this sign because that's incorrect language, you get a fine, something like that. Mm-hmm. So people usually do speak the standard language, but of course this depends on the level of education, level of exposure to the standard language and all that. Also, the standard language is a little bit, because it's a sort of political creation, a bit abstract concept. So everybody, even their standard language, which they were schooled in or potentially grown up with, we all speak it with some particular dialect or some particular accent. Well, not necessarily dialect, but some accent. Like even when I speak standard language, people in my mother tongue, Slovak, people can tell I'm from Western Slovakia as opposed to Eastern Slovakia. That's how, you know, however hard I try. So it's even that sort of, even when you have a bunch of recordings in standard language, you have to be aware that they are not all the same, of course. People will sound different. Of course, then we can, what we want to record, many of us, what we're interested in, is to record the dialectal speech. That's a real thing. That's how people really speak. It's not sort of necessarily the political creation. This is the means of communication, dialectal speech. But it's kind of tough to record dialectal speech, precisely because of all these sort of influences of the standard language and prestige and all of that type of things. It's actually super difficult to get somebody on the street, put them to the studio and tell them to speak in the dialect. People don't want to do that. People, you know, either there are all sort of possible options. People sort of simply speak standard language as much as they can speak standard language, or then they sometimes do this kind of cartoonish form of the dialect. They sort of exaggerate some features. Sometimes, I don't know, in some countries, I don't know whether, like in my home country, there is a very big, strong dialectal variation, geographical east and west. Actually, the standard Slovak is the quantity language. We have long and short vowels only, not consonants. And it's the sort of the first syllable stress, fixed stress language. But Eastern Slovak is a non-quantity language. They don't use quantity, and they use penultimate stress pattern. So this is a big difference. Prosodically, it's a very different language. Well, but then there are, because, you know, on TV there are these comedy shows or whatever, or they want, again, these actors want to mark that somebody is from the East. So there is this sort of mock Eastern dialect. And bizarrely enough, very many of the people from the East, when in a studio, they kind of convert to these think what they think that the researcher wants to hear, as opposed to the ways how they want to. So it's really tough. I guess really you need sort of, I don't know, I don't have huge experience with the field recordings, but even in a field recordings, it must be really difficult to tell people to speak dialects. This is a huge challenge. I have no solution to that. Maybe if you let people to speak a lot, maybe they will eventually kind of converge to the. We have with my student, we did some Slovak recordings. Monika, who was here, the Slovak recordings, and we let people to read from all parts of Slovakia. Read them to read actually this rather engaging and sort of quite shocking story, which was like, I don't know, 3 pages maybe story, so rather long. And you could see how, because it was rather engaging, the story, it was read speech, you could see how they went to the dialect on the second page, because it was sort of interesting story. So they kind of forgot a little bit about what they tried to kind of communicate, and they really, so there are tricks, but I don't know, it's not easy. Of course, then there are all sort of other things like accented speech, like foreign, different accents on L2 speech, I can record myself speaking English, and one can look at what does it mean. How does Slovak speaking English differ from the Indian speaking English, or native speaker and all that. So there are all sort of other possible combinations. We are interested in all many things. Again, when we record this accented speech, that's kind of also difficult because people either refuse to record something in the language when they are not super confident, or they sort of underestimate their abilities, or they overestimate their abilities sometimes, and they say, sure, I can do that, and then you realize that actually they don't. So they're all sort of, and because we need the metadata, we have to record all of these possibilities. We have to be aware that when we throw that data to the machine, we have to be aware that what comes out might or might not be representative. So those are all type of things. Of course, we were talking about this a little bit, about the recording quality. Again, depends massively on the question. We actually talked about the difficulties in the recording speech materials in the all type of studios, on the street, in the, many other conditions. One thing which has changed in, I wouldn't even say in my lifetime, but in a small portion of my lifetime, is that everybody nowadays has the recording device on them. This, to your surprise, this was not normal 20 years ago. Nobody had a recording device on them. Nowadays, you can actually ask people, like we did you, to record yourself. Of course, the computers can record, and even computers were not routinely equipped with mics until 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or something. So now that's sort of crazy. That opens up new possibilities, of course, that we can essentially ask anybody to go find some nicely furnished, soft furnished, quiet corner in their room and then record themselves. And of course, there is a huge amount of, until 20, 30 years ago, we purely relied on sort of radio. It was like a very limited amount of channels. Now there's infinite amount of channels. There are all sort of podcasts and YouTube videos and whatever. So there is vast amount of speech being recorded as we speak. So that opens up new possibilities, and I'm not completely fluent in exploring those at all. It's left to you, I guess, to do that. So now, again, metadata. This is the very, very important part. So what do we need to store? Again, of course, this is a mantra. Depends on research question, right? So we need to store all sorts of information about the speaker. Anything which we might need for the later analysis. What does it mean that we might need it for the later analysis? Anything which is a potential source of variation. Anything, any type of information which might influence how the recording sounds. What is there in the recording? So gender, I'll talk about that in some soon. Age, when younger people sound different. Of course, small kids sound different. Younger people sound different. Older people, etc., etc. You know that there are these two different directions actually of the general voice change, and it's in terms of the pitch, the average pitch For female speakers, there is this called postmenopausal pitch drop. So after the menopause, the pitch drops ever so slightly, but discernibly. We have many of the data where you have to be aware of that when you analyze the average pitch, and you have, from one village you have only young women, and from the other village you have older women. You cannot then say like, oh, in that village they have a lower pitch than in this village, because you might have all of these things. For male it goes the other way around. I don't know, I don't think that there is official recognized menopause for men, so I don't know what the name for that would be, but there is a slight rise. A little bit less pronounced than the females, but a slight rise of the older men has higher pitch than the younger men in general. All sort of things like in the mother tongue, when we record the English data that we recorded today, of course we want to see the mother tongue of the people. Mother tongue itself is a bit of a theoretical concept, I guess, for people. This is a very Europe-centric concept. Eurocentric after Second World War concept, when Europe was, I guess, unprecedentedly divided to these small pieces of land where everybody spoke one standard language and pretty much nothing else. So this sort of single language, and that's kind of easy to ask what your mother tongue is. Of course, nowadays, even in Europe, it's much more complicated. And for the rest of the world, I think this big chunk of the rest of the world, this never really popped up. So people speak in India, of course, all of you speak many languages. And for some of you, it's maybe easier to say which would be the mother tongue. For some of you, it might be kind of difficult to say. In Africa, it's completely out of question. Everybody speaks 4 or 5 languages, and they are used in different contexts. Even with a mother, you might use one language when you talk about cooking and the other language when you talk about schoolwork or something like that. So my daughters my wife is Finnish, so they are sort of half Finn, half Slovak. They were born in Ireland, so they are Irish citizens, and but the older one in particular went to school for some period of time in Germany. They are very confused when you ask them about the mother tongue. they sort of refuse to talk about that. Now, of course, like the domicile, where you reside, maybe some of your history when you move around. My daughters, for example, would be a good example. The first 3 years or 4 years Ireland, next 4 years Germany, the remainder Finland, something between Slovakia for a year or so. So that would be kind of interesting, I guess. Place of birth, where people grow up, social economic info. In many cultures, in every culture, there is a kind of correlation between the way how people speak and the social economic background. In some cultures it's more pronounced than in the other. For example, British English is very sort of layered in terms of the social background. Some other European languages less so, for example. Occupation, education, name it, all sort of things. One thing, actually, as you noticed here, which you don't really need, is the name, for example, or phone number, or email address, or hair color. So there are many things you might not really require, because you don't think, well, I never thought of anybody who would kind of investigate the hair color sort of variation in speech or something like that, and hopefully I will never see anybody like that. So you, of course, you really need to think hard what types of sort of characteristics of the speaker might influence the way how they speak. And you don't really need to store the stuff which you are confident enough that they will not. Of course, then you want to maybe store also the underlying linguistic material. Text, whatever is read speech, you might want to store what they read. If it's sometimes we read these different words, for example. We are really interested in some tonal pattern in a word, or prosodic pattern in a word, quantity in Finnish, minimal pairs and all that. And we usually read them embed them in some carrier phrases, as we call them. So in English, almost all the basic phonetic material is actually not about English, or segmental stuff, but about segmental stuff as pronounced in the carrier phrase, read sometime again, So we sometimes, because this can be really repetitive, what we do, we a little bit vary the carrier phrase. So you might log, for example, what carrier phrase was used for this particular thing. Sometimes you might be, in particular in these sort of finely controlled phonetic experiments, what might also be very super useful is to log the sort of the order number of the thing, because you might very often the way how the speech is realized depends heavily on what you said before or after. Well, not necessarily after, but before, and whether it was at the beginning or at the end. Of course, if you read the list, we very often ask people to read something 10 times, and then we only use like second or third repetition, because the end is sort of boring, but first is taking a breath in. So all of these type of things you might want to log. We had this very clear example of that. We did quite a lot of research in Lombard speech. You know what Lombard speech is? The speech in the loud environment, when you speak in some ambient noise. And of course, there are all sort of relatively well documented adaptations to that. So you, of course, when there is a noise around, you shout more, but you only compensate about half of the noise. So if there is a noise of whatever 40 decibel, you only increase your output by about 20 decibel. But you also increase the pitch, which again manages to carry the voice better. And you change, remember we're talking about the spectral slope up. So you speak more like that. You put more energy in high frequencies, which we hear more. So you do all of these, and you also do some temporal variation, which you lengthen the vowels and shorten the consonants, funnily enough, you know. Because vowels are good in the noise, consonants are bad. So we did a lot of the recordings, and you know, we put some noise to the people's headphones and tell them to do something. We actually did these articulatory recordings, they had the wires sticking from their mouth, and then you put the noise out and tell them to sell something, and then you put the noise back. It turns out that actually the noise level before these particular recordings is as informative as the noise level currently. Because people sort of carry on, you know. When you blast 80 decibel into somebody's headphone, so they shout, and then you switch the noise, they keep shouting. So this is the very sort of extreme example, but you might want to know in what order you're recording, in particular for the finely controlled experiments. Of course, some annotations, if we have them, they're priceless. Segmentation, all sort of things, you know, we might want to have with our recording. Types of phrasal breaks, in the normal sort of recorded speech, hesitations, if we can have them, and this type of whatever we can get hands on, it would be good. Now, this is actually one of the kind of conundrums of the speech science, because we are put between sort of two millstones. There are two requirements imposed on us from the society, actually. And one is security and safety. So, well, they are both concerned about security and safety and actually scientific paradigm. So on the one hand, we have to commit ourselves to not harm the people who are kind enough to donate their sort of biological sample almost, as it were, you know, they donate their voice. So, because human speech is a biomarker. Human speech is almost as much biomarker as the fingerprint. So you know, if all of us have slightly different timbre of our voice, so we actually can recognize people by their voice, even when we don't see them. Machines can do it way better than us. So the voice, there are of course some even voice kind of security features that you just tell something and it lets you go or something like that. So we have to minimize the possibility that this somehow leaks around, and then sort of the bad people get hands on our recordings, and then they use to access somebody's bank account or something like that with that, you know. So we and we have to of course think about what's possible now, but we have to also think about the future. There is a sort of arms race as always between the good guys and bad guys. So all of these, whatever ways of use technological applications come, they also comes sort of misuse of technological applications. So we have to make sure somehow that we are protecting the people. But on the other hand, as honest scientists, we are strongly encouraged to publish our data, because so that we don't make things up, you know, essentially. So that we want to kind of produce the results which are reproducible, which anybody can. That's why we write these methodological sections where we say how we did that in some precise. We publish the code with our stuff and all that. So we should publish the data as well. This is a conundrum. This is a difficult one. because we can publish data, but we shouldn't. So there are many different ways how to sort of deal with that somehow. There is no perfect way. There are just sort of better ways than the others. There are some good practices, you know. So of course we want to secure the data storage somehow, so that the villains cannot just go and download them from somewhere. And in particular, the personal information. It's sort of bad enough if somebody's voice is freely available on the internet, but it's nowhere near as bad if all her or his personal information are attached to that. So as long as we manage to, so it might be okay to publish some voice samples, but it should not be traceable ideally to the people who did that, whose voice that is. If I was some villain trying to rob the banks, I would start with phoneticians, because our voices are all over the place, because we use them in all public lectures and all that. Essentially all the voices you have heard, well, you should have heard yesterday during my presentation, were some fellow phoneticians. Of course you want to obtain create some agreement with the participants. You want to obtain some written consent, about informed consent from the participants that they are happy, and they should be informed. It should be consent. They should say that they are happy. It should be informed consent. They know what they are getting into, right? Maybe sometimes what helps is to share the sort of results of the processing steps rather than the raw recordings. So for example, we might share the wave-to-wave transforms of the things heavily processed. In particular, because we are doing some particular analysis step where the processing depends on the other data. So we are doing some dimensionality reduction. So it's not, in theory, I guess, the wave-to-wave can be reverse transformed, although it's a lossy transformation. So in the future, maybe somebody can find, how to recover the voice back. But because we do extra transformations, which sort of depend on the full database, as it were, all the other recordings there, so maybe that's relatively safe. That's probably not reversible. So maybe something like that we can publish. We can publish maybe 1 or 2 voice recordings with it, so somebody can try that it really works, that type of a thing. Maybe F0 intensity contours are quite safe, for example, to publish. So these are difficult ones. Now, by the way, I'm talking about that, and you should be thinking, oh, well, but this guy wants to collect our data this afternoon. Is he not the evil guy, despite. So we'll talk about that as well. We have some ideas. We unfortunately, because of the practicalities, we don't really have huge amount of possibilities to sort of write the written consent, but we will provide you several possibilities how to share the data with us. So the base, we will sort of maybe create, Tuukka is working on that, create some Google Drive where we can sort of maybe upload your data if you want. But of course, by definition, because uploading is going to be visible for the others. But if you don't want to do that, you can just send the data to us in some particular way, and we will only publish we will process the data in terms of these embeddings and what have you, the WAV2X, and then we only share with the others those things. But we can talk about it in the afternoon when we are preparing the database. And we will have this we will create this metadata thing where you fill in, but of course you fill in only the information you want, and you are absolutely, this goes for the online people, you are of course perfectly free to withdraw your participation in that. It's absolutely fine. There is zero repercussions. We will not figure out who did that. We will not try to match and punish you somehow. Not at all. We are the good guys. Of course, one thing which is something which we should always try to think about is how can the research we are doing sort of benefit the community. This comes very often, this comes as a question very often in particular sort of minority language setup, because there are all type of sort of relationships between the, let's say, majority and the minority, and very often it comes like, well, why would I do that? What is the benefit for me in that? We in Finland, we have this relatively small indigenous population, the Sami people who live in Lapland in the very north of Europe. That's apparently the only indigenous peoples in Europe left. And they, historically, the experience of that community with the sort of majority peoples, like the Finns and Norwegians and Swedes and Russians, is not necessarily very positive. And I'm putting it mildly. There were a lot of kind of nasty things being done to the community 100 years ago or so. Nowadays, of course, it's a very interesting community, and we as linguists and everybody else wants to sort of get the data, you know. So we had actually, we're recording one Sami student, a young woman, and she was a little bit late for the recording, and she apologized. I'm sorry, I'm late. I just came back from the hospital. I was giving my DNA, you know, for some other research. So, you know, they might feel themselves as sort of, you know, and we get it very often from them, like, why would I do that? Like, you know, I don't owe you anything, and how will I benefit, or my community benefit from that? So you have to be ready for these type of questions, and or not, and then you say like, actually, I just need my PhD, and you know, please, you know, something like that. There is also the level of anonymization, which might be relevant for some North Indian languages, because we published this paper with this was very fine, actually, articulatory analysis, so very little sort of speakers, but it was because we were looking at this areal variation, so we needed a publication to publish the, you know, some meta information about the speakers, you know, the gender, the location where these people sort of spend most of their life, and we did some age-related analysis. So we published these age groups, and the reviewer asked, like, we would be interested. I want to see, could you publish the age at the recording rather than age group? We published these broad age groups, but we said sorry, we can't, because then the person will be identifiable. These are very small communities of, you know, these actually, some of them are even sort of little bit nomadic communities. So these are very small communities, you know, of maybe 50 people. So if we say that it's a, you know, 54-year-old woman from that village, everybody knows who she is, you know. So those are the things which we have to kind of consider sometimes for the. I prepared something actually. This is, I will acknowledge it hopefully in the version which I share with you. This is some guidelines for informed consent coming from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the US. So this is a little bit sort of US based consent, but because in US the legal kind of environment is so strict that it's good to look at what they have, because they have to have all of the corners covered. So this is in some sense sort of almost maximal level of protection. Of course in Europe we have the GDPR type of things, what is it? That's sort of the Data Protection Act. So I don't know, if you are in Europe and you open any website, you have to kind of accept all the cookies and what have you. So there is a direct legal protection of the thing. So we don't have to specify everything, because many things are by default that we cannot share that type of information and all that. So, but anyway, these are some sort of questions you might want to consider when you are sort of recording the data. So yeah, so these are some points, as we were saying, about what type of information we might want to provide and what type of information we might want to require in the sort of informed consent. By the way, I was talking about my own experiences in the sort of all type of phonetic and speech recordings. I'm sure that you yourselves, between yourself, have many more interesting sort of experiences. Many of you have recorded more of the dialectal material than I ever attempted. So please feel free to share them. We can have the debate at the end. I guess all of us are very, very interested in these type of things, to maybe avoid some potential mishaps in the future or learn from the best practices. So maybe at the end of this talk we can not only ask questions, but please share your own experiences with the others. So back to the informed consent. So we might want to ask these type of questions. Who is eligible to participate? So it means that we might want to specify in the informed consent some sort of limitations. What we actually require from the speaker. This is when the speaker would sort of or the participant would sort of a little bit commit herself or himself to kind of, oh yeah, I fulfill. Usually we very standardly want some, no history of hearing and speech sort of problems, and that you are really speaker of the language, and all those type of things. We might want to tell the people, the participants, what is the purpose of the study. That's an informed part of the informed consent. They should know what we are after. This can be sometimes tricky. Usually in our type line of research, when we do some phonetic stuff, we can be reasonably open about that. Although sometimes when you want to investigate something like tonal things or quantity, and you tell them that you're into the quantity, it might sort of put their attention too much towards that, and they get sort of exaggerate whatever things. So of course we did also some sort of psychoacoustic experiments when you essentially try to trick the people a little bit. Very often these psychological experiments, it's tricky. You might even tell them, I'll tell you at the end. You might debrief people, but you might need to sort of couch it in the phrase which is true, but is not harmful for the study essentially. Because you should tell as much as you can, but of course sometimes telling everything would sort of ruin the study. Of course, where would the study take place? How long will it last? So you should commit to these type of things. So so that you don't trick people to come somewhere, pretends that they're going to take 5 minutes, and 8 hours later they are still recording. We do that sometimes with ourselves. Like we had this. I did in my past life as a phonetician. I did quite a lot of articulatory recordings. I don't know if you know the EMA machine. It's the you glue these sensors to people's tongue and lips and inside, and then there's wires sticking out. So you apply, and you cannot really torture people. It's not painful. It's not nothing. It's just very uncomfortable. Particularly sitting in this boot, attached to the machine, so you can't really go out. You can't really go to the bathroom, for example. So with the subject, like we limit the study for like 2 hours or something usually. But ourselves, when we did record ourselves as phoneticians, 8 hours, 10 hours, somebody walking with a machine to you with a bathroom, So, but normally you should not do that, of course. But of course, it also has the repercussions on how people get tired and all that. And you should tell them. You should tell people what they will be asked to do, in advance. So they should know that they're going to speak on a microphone, and if you want to give them electroshocks while you're doing that, you have to tell them that it's going to happen. So, of course, this is a tricky one. What are people might be interested in hearing? What are the benefits from doing this study? So this is what we were talking about earlier. Sometimes some particular, in the medical research, for example, there might be some potential benefits. When you are exploring some new drug and you suspect that this drug might work, you might say it might actually heal you, as a matter of fact. So what are the benefits of somebody being in the study? So this particular form from the University of Massachusetts provides this helpful suggestion of formulation, something like, you might not directly benefit from the research, but we hope that participation may, and then we want to be as honest as we can. Maybe we can help your community, or can help preservation of your language. Sometimes we record the databases of the minority languages, Sami, for example, for the speech technology applications. So actually they would have the access to the speech technology in their own language, which of course then has repercussions in order to sort of preservation of the language, because the young people then can actually use the machine technology in the minority language rather than majority language, and young people use the technology a lot. So if they spend half of their time using technology in the Finnish, they are less likely to then speak Sami than if they can use the technology in Sami and things like that. This is very important. What are my risks of being in this study? This is the very important informed part of the consent. Normally this has been thought of when this type of informed consent protocol was introduced in academia, and this was actually introduced in between 1940s and 70s in Europe. Tragically, the source of this type of informed consent idea was a consequence of the atrocities during the Second World War, where a lot of prisoners were subjected to horrendous treatment. And this was actually part of in Europe, the sort of, after the war was this Nuremberg conference where all of these sort of issues were being discussed, and this is direct offspring of that thing. So this is so what they meant at the beginning. What is the risk of my study is that you are going to die or something like that, you know, or you are going to get hurt badly or whatever. Something might fall on your head. So that's usually, luckily, not the huge risk in our case. Our studios are reasonably well sort of built and screwed and all that. So but of course now there are other risks we are talking about. And people should be aware of that. There is a potential risk of compromising maybe some privacy or something like that. And of course then we have to say, how will my personal information be protected? So what are we doing in order not that to happen? Mm-hmm. Of course, people might want to. This is a contract of some sort, you know, signed by all of those people. So people might, you know, want like, will I receive any payment for taking? So that's of course going to go there. What if I have questions? What happens if people have questions? Maybe we can specify that. Not all of these points, by the way, are mandatory. This is a sort of wish list. I can hardly imagine the sort of situation when. What if I have questions? I don't know what I would actually put there, honestly. Now, this is very important. Can I stop being in the study? One of the sort of principles of scientific research is that the participation is purely voluntary. And that means that participants can quit at any moment without no repercussions. Which means that, in theory at least, I guess kind of cultural habits kind of prevent this happening very often, but in theory, you are supposed to pay the full fee, even if the person quits immediately at the beginning, because after the contract has been signed. Because otherwise, you are sort of creating a power position, and you are sort of forcing them, potentially doing something which is uncomfortable for them. This is very important, and they should be informed about that. That you are willing, you are perfectly fine to quit anytime with no kind of repercussions or no bad feelings. This, by the way, goes also for today's sort of thing. When you can, if you put the data, you share it with us, you can always tell us to remove them anytime. If your point is sort of showing as an outlier somewhere, no. So, and here is the last sort of bits I directly copied from the University of Amherst, University of Massachusetts in Amherst information. These are some suggested statements. And when signing this form, agreeing to voluntarily enter this study, I have a chance to read this consent form, and it will be explained to me. It was explained to me in a language which I use and understand. This is also important that in many relevant situations for us, this might be something very important, that you don't read something fast in English and hope for and assume that people have understood what was explained to them. I have had the opportunity to ask questions and receive satisfactory answers. I understand that I can withdraw at any time. A copy of this signed informed consent has been given to me. And then you can sort of put these are suggested statements. I agree that segments of the recording made by participation in this research may be used for conference presentations as well as education and training of future researchers practitioners, for example. This is something we might implicitly think that you will consent to today. Maybe not conference presentations, but for the training of you at least. Or academic purposes, sometimes we put this type of a phrase. Sometimes we also say the phrase that will not be used for commercial purposes. So we commit ourselves not to sell it ever, or give it to some institution or company who might kind of rake benefit out of that. I agree to have my recordings archived for future research in the field of dialogue studies or dialectology. This might be kind of interesting. This might be something useful, So you give a consent because you were told that this is going to benefit your community and a particular sort of dialect, but you don't want that data to be used to study speech impairments or something like that, or study whatever fine-tuning speech synthesis stuff. You know, so you might kind of limit your the field within which you're actually consenting to be this data to be used. So you don't want Facebook to train their systems on that, or even academic institution to train their synthesis on your speech. You just want really them to use it for the dialectal studies, for example. I do not agree to allow segments of recording participation in research to be used for conference, presentation, education, and training purposes. You might have these tick boxes, and the person can sort of pick one. Something like that. Of course, these are just guidelines copied from somebody. Different legal systems require different things, different type of formulations are used in different cultures. The language of the consent form might need to be adapted and all of type of things. Mm-hmm. Of course, many institutions provide their own sample consent forms. I don't know whether IIT, in general IIT Guwahati has one. There are ethical committees and universities, they might have some say on these consent forms and all that. So let's get back from these sort of legal things to sort of the way how to design a database, what to think about in the database things. So these are just some examples. I was kind of talking about these sources of variation. So let's kind of a little bit zoom into those sources of variation. So this is, I just tried to a little bit limit here, put here all sort of influences which give rise to this diversity, to name them. So we were talking about as individual, there are the linguistic, phonetic type of differences, there are the other things. So individual would be again gender or biological sex of people, age, languages spoken, social economic background, potential disorders, where they grew up, the language education, all of those things, Linguistic, phonetic, now what language the sample is in, what is the dialect, socialect, potentially, is it formal or spontaneous, sort of register, is it read, what type of, form, is it a question, is it an answer, is it Lombard speech, all of what is the environmental noise around, all of those type of things. Potentially, we phoneticians very often sort of forget that's how obsessed we are in how people speak. Potentially even something, what are people saying, that also is a big source of variation, I guess, in speech. And then there are the other things like recording conditions, like mic type or sampling rate, and all of the other sort of post-processing steps, like, has it been compressed, has it gone through the MP3 stage at some point of its life, has it been somehow filtered or something like that. Mm-hmm. So all of these are sources of variation. All of these influences make a difference in how the speech recording actually sounds. So there are some sources of variation which are sort of subject matter of our research, which we actually really want to investigate, and then there are the others which we want to sort of ignore, which we are not interested in. This is, of course, depending on the choice of the question. So, for example, if you want to do the purely dialect analysis, so recordings from some language, like we had the Assamese data, and we want to check how, as we did, how the way how people speak correlates with where they are from. So then only the dialect is actually what you want to have, and everything else essentially you want to remove. Everything else you somehow want to know what are dialect differences, regardless of all the other potential influences. So sometimes you might want something like we did in that Finnish study, Tukka's Finnish study, that you are interested in the dialect and gender and age, and how these things interact. But you're not interested in whether people have iPhone or Android phone. All of those things you want to sort of wipe out. You want to treat them as some sort of random effects, as something which does not influence your results. Or I don't know, languages of the world, the language, assigned language of the recording, what we're interested in, and not the dialect. Like, for example, English recording in that database contained Englishes from all over the world. They are just completely mixed together. The British, American, I don't know, Tukka might know, is there Indian English in among those English recordings in the voice, common voice? No. You don't know, actually, yeah. This all sort of put together, so the dialect, the variant, is completely hidden from the users. So that's the source of variation. You might want to try to kind of ignore or remove. Ignoring doesn't mean pretend it's not there, by the way. Ignore means do something about that potentially. Now, or maybe just region is the interesting thing. Or any of these, there are many, almost any possible combination might be kind of cool to investigate. So how can we kind of minimize the effects of the we cannot remove, unfortunately, fully the effects of the unwanted variation. If we wanted to remove the effect of the unwanted variation, we would probably need to record all people, whatever they said ever in history, So then we would have the complete data and we can sort of just analyze them. That's when somebody asks me, what database do you want? I always say, I want, like from that given language, I want all the utterances ever uttered in that language. That's the first step, that's what I want. And then we have to start sort of making compromises, as you can imagine. So one thing which is relatively easy-ish to remove is the recording setup issues. So this is simple. We just use the same mic, right? It's simple at the first sight. We use the same mic. We use it in a way that it should be used. We use it as our same studio or the same type of setup. We use it as supposed to be used. Now, if we are experienced, and there are many way more experienced people than me, recording people, we might need to control how far the mic is from the mouth, roughly. How is the gain set up on the recording things. Make sure that your recording cable doesn't go over the source, which is plugged to the mains, and adds the 50 Hertz hum, and all of those type of things. This is all about the experience of the people. If we do field recordings, unfortunately, we cannot completely control all the environmental noises. We just have to then ideally, well, I'll talk about that in a second, what other things we can do. Post-processing also, sometimes whatever there is a lot of noise, so we filter, a low-pass filter or high-pass filter or something like that, or some speech recording. So we have to make sure that we ideally do it kind of consistently across all the recordings. Some sort of things like something we can kind of remove the source of variation by sort of control, imposing some sort of control on the data gathering or on the database, on the corpus. So for example, we can, as if very often we kind of control out the potential disorders. If somebody is sort of hard of hearing, that might influence the way how they speak, so we just apologize and say like, we cannot use your data in the thing. Or somebody suffers from the very heavy stuttering or something like that. We unfortunately might not be able to include those people in some sort of database which does not want to distinguish between people who stutter and don't stutter. We can of course kind of control whether we use formal or spontaneous speech and not mix them up too much, because these sort of registers make a huge difference. We can of course control linguistic material in some of the things. They all read the same thing or something like that. Form and all. Of course we can control just about any of these things. We can control, if it works like that, we can just record people from the same region. It depends on what is the situation. If there is if there is some magical one city where all possible dialects are spoken, or we want to only look at some sort of city dialects or whatever it would be called, then we just stick to that one city and record things from there. Anything can be controlled. Control means that you are sort of trying to remove as much of variance as you can. You stick to one of those possible values of that particular variable, and you just sit with that. The other thing, some of the things can be removed by sort of signal processing and analysis. You know, so gender, sex, for example, F0 contours can be sort of normalized. Priyanku was talking about it yesterday when there was some Angami hour tones, and they were sort of Z-scored, which means that you essentially remove people average pitch and their variance. So some of these things some of the effects of some particular variables can be removed sort of either using some signal processing methods or statistically. In statistical analysis, we have some random effect models which can sort of tell that these are the unwanted sources of variance, essentially. Ignore, in your interpretation of this data, ignore these effects and only concentrate on the effects of the interest. So, linguistic material, I don't know what I meant when I kind of marked that, but you know, you can sort of, I don't know, delexicalize things and do all sort of other potential things. Of course, all of this is just very kind of broad ideas and nothing kind of novel, I guess. This is sort of kind of straightforward. Just one kind of wants to think about these type of possibilities, and one wants to do it sort of correctly. For example, we have a sort of anecdote. The Swedish study, the Swedia database we used. It's, as I said, it's a rather big database, and we only use small fraction of that. They have these recordings from I think 107 locations, and depending on the size of the location, they can be between, I don't know, 7 and 100 speakers. Like Stockholm is one of the locations, so they have many, and they can be smaller places. And it's a really big one. So after they recorded it, they divided the database among 3 labs in Sweden, one in Stockholm, in Göteborg, and Uppsala. Doesn't really matter. The labs, really sort of important phonetic labs, very competent, and they divided the database because there was like beyond every lab sort of ability to post-process it. And all of them post-processed it somewhat differently, the data. And that's sort of bad enough that there were some processing artifacts which depended on the lab which processed that data. The bigger problem for us, was that they divided the data geographically among themselves. So data from southern Sweden went to one lab, from central Sweden and Finland went to the other, and northern Finland went to the third lab. So now when we wanted to do the region-based analysis of the data, this was a huge problem, because we didn't know whether our machine learning system detects a real source of variation which we're interested in, or the source of variation which was imposed on the data by the post-processing steps. That's actually one of the reasons why we only analyzed F0 and intensity, because those things were robust based on those things survived the treatment of our Swedish colleagues, but intact. But these things have to be kind of aware of that. It might become an issue when you are combining databases. That, you know, somebody has collected Assamese data and somebody else has collected Mizo data and somebody else connected, I don't know, Angami data, and they are more or less the same. And when you combine them together, and you want to see the differences, you have to be aware of these issues. Then maybe the data, sort of by definition, almost were use different mics, different post-processing, you know, different chopping techniques. All of these things, they are recoverable sometimes, but one has to be aware of that. Very often you see this sort of. That's why. What I was saying earlier, that when you see these very good results, too good to be true, that's when you start to be suspicious. Whether you are not actually seeing the effects of other source of variation to the one which you are really interested in. This is when one has to get really sort of panicky almost when you see perfect results. So I'm going to just, please, Lina is here so you can stop me when I talk rubbish here. This is the database. The Assamese database, or subset of the Assamese database, which we have been looking at the data. I just use it as a sort of example to illustrate some points. So it is the subset of the database I had on my disposal to run these things. So we had is the recorded Assamese version of the Northern Sun. It's like about 600 people and with 60 towns. This many female and this many males. And this was the information Lina and her colleagues collected: age, gender, place of birth, occupation, father and mother's occupation, and many things like that. Oh, and I forgot to put the most interesting part there, which I find really interesting: the degree of pride in you speaking Assamese. That's cool. We have to I'll be adding that to the databases. Actually. All of this information are stored in a meta file, which contain things like the file name, region name, all of those information. I covered the information there, which I thought would be potentially sensitive. I made double sure that I actually took a screenshot of that covered, so it should not be recoverable. You should not be able to remove it. So yeah, this is how the meta file looks like. We are going to hopefully create similar meta files in the afternoon, with pretty much the same columns. Well, maybe fewer, but something like that. And so this is how you actually create a meta file. And what's important here is that you assign each recording or each, usually, this is kind of a little bit arbitrary, but usually you design some sort of file name agreement. How will you call the files? And very often what we do is that we kind of use something which is like they can identify the speaker or whatever, the database entry uniquely, and maybe we usually put there just for ourselves the sort of the main source of variation which interests us. Like here it's sort of the region, 4 letters for a region, and then 4 letters for the speaker, some ID, you know. In theory, what you can do, you can give completely arbitrary names to the files if you want, and then you use this meta file to match the files with the things. But we usually don't do that because, you know, like it complicates the sort of, you know, we are usually very curious, so we want to quickly see the results, you know, and you can use the file names to split the database, or somebody wants to have only look at these particular data, so you just, you know, filter them and send them somewhere or something like that, or share them with your student. So we will come up with some naming convention today for our data if we're uploading them. Yeah. And then of course you have the file storage when you store the recordings under these files, other file names. This Assamese database, I sort of spent some quality time of looking at distribution of gender among different recording sites. So here the blue, these are 60 recording sites. This is a sort of pie chart for each of them. The sort of telling how much male and female sort of people there are, you know. So these are they're all the same size, but there are some of those, it's usually around 10 speakers, and sometimes a little bit less, and sometimes a little bit more. So it's 10 on average. It's quite close to 10. There's very few which would have like 14 or something, and very few which would like 7 or something like that, or 6. So it averages very well and is not hugely varied. So this of course means that for this recording site, something starting with A, or B probably, is 50-50 precisely, exactly as many males as many females. And you can see that by and large, pretty much for each individual recording site, the gender balance is quite fine. There would be 1 or 2 little outliers, but this is unavoidable. There is always some little irregularity. So this is excellently balanced database in terms of gender distribution of the recordings. Now you might be wondering, why are phoneticians so obsessed with this gender, you know? So, and with the balancing. So the main reason, of course, we were talking about that because of sexual dimorphism of human as a species, there is a very strong source of variation which is gender related, or more precisely biological sex related. So the human biological sex and whatever the hormonal setup influences the primary source of the voice source. The male usually have bigger and longer vocal folds, but also heavier. So it goes, the influence of the sex on the voice goes a little bit beyond the size of difference. So there are clearly some other evolutionary aspects which sort of have formed the female voice to be higher pitch and male voice to be lower pitch. So it's a very strong marker of the thing. So that's why, because we are working with the human voice, and that's one of the first things we can hear, and that's one of the first things the machines latch on. So we have to make sure that we balance the amount of speakers from each of these major categories, as it were. We can, of course, balance it in various ways. We can only allow female speakers, for example. Only allow male speakers. Any balancing is fine. It doesn't have to be 50-50 at all. As long as it's sort of reasonably, that it's controlled, that everything is pretty much the same. Of course, if we only take the female speakers, then we will only know something about the female speaker, about the dialectal variation about the female speakers. If we only take the male speakers, same thing, you know. But the balancing is important. So, for example, like imagine, like this is like obvious kind of thought. Like imagine if for all the recording sites from, you know, the Western Assam, we would only have males, and from the Eastern Assam only females. And then we would get that dendrogram which we produced, and we'd be very happy about that, you know. What would the first reviewer say to us about that? He was like, oh, so in Assam the male and female sound different. That's a good one, you know. So we have to make sure, otherwise that would be called the very extreme case of confounding. That we cannot distinguish the one source of variation from the other source of variation. So we cannot distinguish the source of variation which we're interested in from the source of variation we want to ignore. That was the exact example of the Sweden database. That we could not, the problem was actually not that they divided the data among 3 labs and processed them. The problem was that they divided it precisely on the geographical characteristic we're interested in. It was a confounding effect. So if they randomly distributed data among the 3 labs, that would be fine for us. Because these things would it would be well balanced. The processing side would be well balanced among the different sort of recording sites. So we would get these pie charts if we had these sort of 3 labs. We would get these pie charts, which would be roughly third of the recordings from each site would be processed in a given lab. But of course, we would get, if we did that in the Swedish data, put these 104 pie charts, we would have for the 1/3 of the data, we would get only one color. For the other, we would get the other color, and for the third, we would get the other color. That would be exactly the same thing as having the female data only from one area and the male data from the other area. So that was extremely well unbalanced thing. There was a strong confound. That we couldn't tell whether what we're analyzing is the areal variation or the processing steps of our colleagues. So this is the reason why we are so obsessed with balancing, and why we are seemingly so obsessed with the gender or any other big sources of variation. There is many other ones, you know. For example, age. Again, if we only record older people from one area, this is a more realistic situation, as a matter of fact. Older people from one area and younger people from the other area, then again, we cannot really, and do it systematically, we cannot really distinguish what we are investigating. This is a relatively realistic scenario in dialectal research, because you might be able to only record older people from some very remote locations and young people from a city. Or the other way around, the young people from the city and only old people, young people from remote locations, because they might still speak the given dialect, but in the city you would be only left with the older people, because all young people would speak some other form of the language. So this is much more, and one has to kind of, again, remember that things should be balanced, because otherwise we are falling into this confound problem. We are falling into the problem where we don't know whether we're investigating one source of variation or the other source of variation. Educational level, language education, all of these things would ideally want to be balanced. Now the last thing I want to show you is this sort of representativeness of recordings. This is a very closely related sort of topic to what I was talking about. And this was actually, so this actually is a very big concern in the Common Voice database. There's a question how representative you have this recording somewhere in the database, some waveform, and there is a label or some metadata which tells this is English, and or this is whatever. They use the ISO codes, so this is whatever Hindi or this is Slovak, and that's what you take at the face value. But who recorded? But you don't usually have. You can have some meta information. Maybe, of course, male, female. Maybe some age bracket. That's just about it. You know. Now the question is like, how do you know whether this type of recording is representative of the given label? As a matter of fact, because many of this data was crowdsourced, there is a strong confounding of the sort of, in particular, sort of social demographic aspects of the people who provided the speech, and they sort of, well, yeah, between the language and the social demographics of the people who confound the speech. In many parts, like in a lot of French recordings, actually to native French speakers sound like sort of more, you know, the North African immigrants, recent North African immigrants to France, because they, you know, because they would be they had been the clientele which the campaign or whatever got them, you know. Some people in the database, when listen to those data, some people sound non-native completely, you know, because it was crowdsourced, it was very difficult to control. Some people, like English, for example, we don't know who those people are almost at all. So there was very many sort of, there was some Swedish recording, I was sometimes browsing through them, it was a Swedish recording, which was definitely not Swedish, it was just mislabeled, you know. So that's one of the issues. Of course, the big size of database little bit solves these things, because we have all sort of things, but we have to remember that there might be some confounding effects again. That, for example, in France, because maybe if the pay is the same all over the world, then you get some, you know, $1 per half an hour recording, you will get different people contributing in Europe and different people contributing in India, because it's a very little money in one place and maybe okay sort of salary different. So you get, you know, very different people with access to recording apparatus and all of those. So one has to be aware that all of these type of effects actually exist in the databases we are faced. On the other hand, you know, this opens up a sort of other question. So, okay, so I just said that, you know, there was North African speaking French, there was some non-Swedish people only pretending to speak Swedish, there were people from different areas, but what is a prototypical actually speaker of the language? You know, in current France, first generation, maybe second generation, or even the recent North African immigrant is a very, very good representative of the language as it is actually spoken in France, or at least in some regions of France. So, as you know, as I always say, Indian English is the main variety of English nowadays in the world, by miles with the most native speakers. So why would some standard Oxford English be the prototypical representative of English and not English spoken in Bombay? You know, so this is, of course, this opens the other question And this opens the question like what we are really analyzing. This is the same with the dialects, same with the languages, same with all sort of things. But this is a more philosophical question than the other. Cool. Okay, very good. So we have some time for questions, comments. So sampling rate, of course, is something which can be relatively easily converted. Of course, you can, like in Pratt, you could just 1 click or 2 clicks, you know, you can convert 48 to 400 or something like that, and that's gonna be kind of fine, you know. You can, so the answer number one is, it depends on what you want to use it for. You know, if you want to use it for extracting F0, extracting some particular characteristics, formants, it doesn't really matter. If you want to, of course, use some sort of script to do that, then you might be better to kind of have them at the same frequency, because some of those you have to otherwise read the frequency if it's automatic things and all that. If you, or you know, so you can convert them to 44 or whatever. Usually you rather want to convert them to the lower one rather than to the higher one, because if you are trying to convert it from the lower frequency to higher frequency, you are making up some information which is not really there. But if converting it from higher to lower frequency, you are sort of just losing some information. Of course, there might be, as Priyanka was saying, it depends on what was the range of a microphone. You might not have any frequencies from those high frequencies there at all anyway, if the microphone range only goes to whatever 20,000 hertz or 18,000 hertz or whatever. So then it almost makes no difference. Now, if you want to, on the other hand, if you want to use the data for some machine processing application, then there is a little problem. Because most of these conversions do leave some mark somewhere. So, because these machine processing things, they are trained to spot differences, and they're not trained to spot linguistic differences or prosodic differences or spectral differences. They are trained to spot any difference. So they really latch on any type of difference. That's where I was talking about this post-processing in these Swedish labs. It would not be a problem if we extracted F0 and looked at the sort of phonetic things, but we gave it to the machine, and the machine went like, and we asked like, from what region it is, and the machine went like, I know what you mean. It's, you know, this hum, that hum, and this hum, you know, or this spectral slope, and that spectral slope. So if you want to run it to the machine, then it's a little problem, because you might even decide to convert it all to like 18K or something, to convert them both, when hoping that the imprint is going to be the same. We have this little pedagogical thing in mind, that I told you that when you can record your narrative today in wave format, that would be ideal. But if you have corrected in MP3 or something, that's okay, because we can convert it. But if we do that, we will see very likely that those converted things are put aside a little bit, because the machine, the up-to-vex and all, they will spot that difference. They will spot the imprint of that conversion, most likely. In particular, because it's you are inventing information rather than sort of deleting information. So the answer is, you know, depends. You know, what do you need to use it for? And if you if you do it manually, then it doesn't really matter. Or you listen to that, or you mark something, or you extract F0 and then look at the F0 contours or whatever. It doesn't really matter. That they're gonna be fine. If you use some machine learning technique, and you tell it to extract stress patterns, you train it to extract stress pattern, as long as you give it the data with both frequencies, or the data converted and converted, it will learn to ignore that difference, because it doesn't get any reward for that difference. Again, if it's not confounded somehow. So, you know, so that's absolutely fine. Mm-hmm.
I use doubt since you say that the machine learning models, they spot the marks, right? Whenever we are converting them. So just for my case, so when I'm collecting the data, my recorder setting, like default setting is it has to correct at 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate. But when I'm training a black box, right, like GAN models and all, so I need to downsample the data to 16 kilohertz and also the 16 bit.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think the black like knows the marks that the conversion will value?
Well, again, the black box, depending on what you are training it, the neural network, it sort of, when you're training it, it has its loss function, so it gets reward from something, from spotting some differences. And as long as it doesn't get the reward for spotting the differences in the transformation, it will ignore it. So, of course, if you convert all of those data to like all of them have 44 1K, and you convert them all to 16K, there is no problem at all. There is zero problem. The problem only arises when we have this confound, when these non-balancing things, So, for example, like when we collect the data today, that for some bizarre reason, all people from North India have recorded their things in WAV format, all people from North India in MP3 format, and all people from South India in the whatever WAV format, but 16K or something like that. So we have this very strong confound. Then we have a problem. If all of these things are distributed sort of evenly, balanced, then it's not a problem. Because when we train any machine learning things, or as a matter of fact, when we fit any statistical model, it's try to capture the variation. And it's ignorant to where this variation comes from. So what we need to make sure that the variation comes really from the question we're interested in, and not some other confounding factor. That the variation doesn't come from encoding, but as long as the variation which comes from, there will be some variation which comes from encoding, as long as it doesn't sort of reward the model, as long as it's sort of equally distributed, so there is no gain for the model to latch on this particular differences, then it's going to be fine. So if its ability to identify dialect cannot be helped by the type of encoding because it's random, then it's okay. Then it will sort of learn to ignore that. Yeah, any other questions? I'm also sort of keen on hearing some of your experiences from. I'm sure that you have kind of had many positive and negative experiences. Usually the negative ones are good because that's when we learn most, So.
One observation from the field. So we go with all the equipments, headphones, microphone and recorders and whatnot. Sometimes the people are very scared to speak in front of the microphone, particularly when you have something on your body over your head and the microphone is sticking out. And they do make a lot of error at that point of time. And some people do get nervous and shaky voice at the beginning, but then they tend to become normal. But then you do get a lot of error.
Yes, absolutely. But it's general, of course, this is magnified in the field recordings, and in particular in the communities which are not recorded very often. But this is, I think, a completely general trend. If you take the undergrad student to a studio, of course they might not sort of be visibly shaken, but they don't speak the same as they would speak normally, and it takes a while. So we always, this is one of those issues that we always sort of record this lap speech. We have to be aware that even when we do the field recordings, it's a little bit of a lap speech based on what you are saying. The people are sort of self-aware, and and maybe uncomfortable. And the worst thing, of course, happens if they hear their own voice. That's just for all of us. Like we are kind of used to that because we do hear our own voice, but it's strange because, of course, we perceive our own voice very different to how it really sounds. So yeah. So this is for the people who are not used to the recordings. When you sometimes with the students even, I don't know how it would be in the field, but when you just check whether it was okay and you sort of play it, they go.
Yeah, so I was saying that whenever we went to the field to collect dialectal data, so I'm a speaker of Eastern Assamese, hopefully, and when we go to Western Assam, so they have a very different dialect. And because I'm speaking to, I do not know any of the Western Assamese, I can't speak any of the Western Assamese dialects. And because I'm speaking to them in Eastern Assamese, they tend to start speaking in Eastern Assamese. No
Mhm.
matter how much we tell
Mhm.
them that you know we need the Borpetia dialect or the Nalbaria dialect.
Yeah.
So that is one problem that we face. And what we usually do in that case is we take a native person from that particular place, and then as the contact person, and
Mhm.
that person kind of instructs
Yeah.
them or do most of the talking.
Yes, that's cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Of course, with dialect research also there is, unfortunately, this thing, this prestige assigned to some dialects or over the others. This is another of the big issues, that people then sort of refuse to speak the dialects maybe, which are deemed as less prestigious,
Yeah.
and they might to sort of, the dialectal research
That
is
is-
difficult.
That is why, how proud are you of your dialect?
Exactly.
So if they're not very proud, they would start speaking in, try to speak
Mhm.
in the standard variety.
Yeah, exactly. But as our analysis shows, your elicitation method worked, because we
Yeah.
can actually, discriminate those
Yes,
dialects.
yes.
So it was good, absolutely.
I collected some data recently on a Creole that is spoken in Assam. So, in the older people, they speak like the intonation pattern, as audible to me, is different than the younger people. The
Mhm.
younger people try to speak more like Assamese, that's the official language of the state,
Mhm.
and the older people speak differently. So, just by hearing the intonation patterns, it's very different. So, it's kind of very interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's super cool, and of course that can be. Then you can have an hypothesis how to sort of represent the international patterns. What type of, what happened? How did that international pattern come to being, and all those things.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We did some of our actually very original research on this. I don't actually have any examples. We used very old-fashioned techniques for that. Was on the exact Sami. North Sami is one of the Sami languages spoken in North Europe. Like, that's the only one which is sort of kind of viable. It has about 15,000 speakers, and it's the sort of broadcasting language both in Finland and in Sweden. Even on the, there are some channels dedicated to that. But it is spoken in at least 3 countries: Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And there is a very clear, even I can sort of hear it. I don't speak Sami, nor really Finnish or Norwegian, but even I can hear the difference, like whether somebody Sami speaker is from Finland or from Norway. And so we did there was one of the first applications actually where we used this sort of sound change, essentially, a language change, because those two, it's technically the same language, but they are becoming mutually difficult to understand because of intonational patterns, exactly, and some lexical stuff. Numbers, for example, they just take from majority language. I guess happen, and they are super interesting to actually look at, because it's what, for me, it is like the holy grail of sound change, language change. We have this sort of evolution, at our, and these, kind of, mixed languages, and like Nagamese and all of those things. Those are sort of amazing opportunities, in my opinion, to actually investigate, because that's a sort of evolution happening before our eyes. Of course, this has also those kind of repercussions of some linguists would say, like, oh, only this particular variety of this dialect is the real one. We got, for the Sami speakers, a lot of the kind of the younger people said, like, oh, no, you should record my grandma because I don't speak North Sami well. And I was like, well, but you use it daily to talk to your friends. Yeah, but we can sometimes switch and sometimes use the different things, but that's the living language. The grandma, with all due respect to grandma, that's a sort of language disappearing. The way the young people are using the language as it is. So that's the most fascinating thing, in my opinion, to actually see how the language in vivo, how language in real daily use actually is used, with all of those dialects as well, and all the accents and all the Creole languages and all that. I think that's super fascinating. Personally, I find that the most fascinating thing, way more than some, conservation of some particular ways of speaking. I've been living for about 25 years. 25 years ago, I moved away from Slovakia, and my Slovak is fine. Nobody can tell, in some sense. I have no accent whatsoever of anything, and it's fluent enough. But I use sort of idioms, like I'm in time warp. I use sort of the 90s idioms, and people sort of like, as I said, there's no accent, but sometimes I say something, people are like, I never heard that for 20 years. So that's sort of I am not a good representative of the language, and I have sometimes there are new idioms, and I sometimes go like, this is wrong, and then I go like, oh, who am I to say, that this is what people use. Some inflectional patterns has changed ever so slightly and all that, and I just go like, this is horrible, but so you can see the language change, and is my version of Slovak somehow superior to the version of the Slovak which nowadays people speak? Surely, it's silly. Even though some of those idioms which are really hurting my ear are actually calques from English, from advertisement and what have you. So they are kind of wrong, in some sense, from a structural linguistic point of view. They are sort of wrong, but they are there to stay, and that's how the language is. So I think if I could anything, I strongly encourage you to really investigate the language on the street, how people really speak daily, and this is a fantastic region for doing exactly that, because people communicate in so many amazing ways. Good. So thank you very much, and then we go and eat, and I guess we meet at 3:00 here, and we do some hands-on work. I'm very excited about that, and let's keep fingers crossed that it's going to work. And I would love to welcome also the online participants. Please join in, and we will hopefully be able to do these all of these processing kind of remotely.